History often celebrates alliances as if they were forged in steel, unbreakable, permanent, immune to ego and ambition. But in war, alliances are fragile constructions, held together not by treaties, but by restraint, by silence, by the willingness of powerful men to swallow pride for the sake of survival. In the winter of 1944, as snow buried Europe and the largest land war in history reached its final brutal phase, the greatest threat to Allied unity did not come from Berlin. It came from within, from a telegram, from a man who believed command was his by right, and from another who had spent months enduring insults to keep a coalition alive. This is the story of the moment that restraint finally failed. December 29, 1944, Versailles. General Dwight D. Eisenhower reads the telegram from British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery for the third time. The language leaves no room for interpretation. This is not advice, not consultation. It is a demand, cold, direct, and unmistakable. Montgomery is insisting on full control of all Allied ground forces. And if Eisenhower refuses, Montgomery makes his next move clear. He will bypass the Supreme Commander entirely and appeal directly to Winston Churchill and the combined Chiefs of Staff. It is a challenge to authority masquerading as official correspondence. Eisenhower rises from his desk and walks to the window. Outside, the winter landscape lies still beneath frost and pale light. He stares out in silence, long enough that those nearby later estimate nearly 5 minutes pass. When he turns back, something has changed. His staff notices it immediately. Not rage, not irritation, something denser, final. The Supreme Commander has reached the end of his tolerance. He summons his Chief of Staff and begins drafting a response that will shake the alliance to its foundation. What comes next, Eisenhower knows, will determine not only who commands Allied armies, but whether the alliance itself can survive. This is the day Eisenhower makes it clear, first to Washington, that there could be no compromise. Either his authority stood, or he would step aside. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. Late afternoon light slants through tall windows, frost clinging to the glass. Eisenhower sits alone at his desk, the telegram lying where he set it down. Beyond his office, staff officers move quietly through corridors, voices low, aware that something fundamental has shifted. In the operations room, maps still track the Ardennes salient. 13 days after Germany's surprise offensive, American and German forces remain locked in savage combat. The bulge is shrinking, the line is holding. But here, in Versailles, another battle is about to begin. Eisenhower understands the stakes with absolute clarity. This is no longer a dispute over strategy or resources. Eisenhower understands it as an ultimatum. And if he does not act decisively, now, his authority as Supreme Commander will exist in name only. The question is no longer how to manage Montgomery. The question is whether Eisenhower will remain Supreme Commander at all. The fracture between Eisenhower and Montgomery had been widening since September 1, 1944, when Eisenhower assumed direct command of all Allied ground forces. During the Normandy invasion, Montgomery had held that role. He believed, professionally and nationally, that it should have remained his permanently. The change cut deep. Throughout the autumn of 1944, Montgomery pressed relentlessly for a single narrow thrust into northern Germany under his command, rejecting Eisenhower's broad front strategy. In September, he championed Operation Market Garden, an airborne assault to seize key bridges across the Rhine. Even Montgomery's own chief of staff harbored private doubts. The operation failed disastrously at Arnhem, at enormous cost. By October, Montgomery was using back channels to insist that he outranked Lieutenant General Omar Bradley and should command all Allied ground forces as a matter of protocol. Eisenhower deflected. He reorganized commands, adjusted boundaries, compromised where he could, always preserving the larger structure of Allied unity. In November, Montgomery crossed a new line. He sent a private letter so sharply critical of Eisenhower's leadership that Major General Francis de Guingand flew personally to Versailles to prevent an irreparable rupture. Each confrontation followed the same pattern. Montgomery demanded. Eisenhower absorbed. The alliance survived, but at a growing cost. American commanders were losing patience. Bradley, in particular, simmered with resentment at what he saw as British arrogance enabled by American restraint. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's own deputy, openly argued that Montgomery should be relieved. Then came December 16, 1944. At 0530 hours, German forces under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt launched Operation Wacht am Rhein through the Ardennes forest. 3 German armies slammed into an 80-mile front held by 4 American divisions. The blow split Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army from Lieutenant General William Simpson's Ninth Army, severing communications with Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg. On December 20th, Eisenhower made a decision he knew would be explosive. He temporarily placed the 1st and Ninth Armies under Montgomery's operational control. Militarily, the logic was sound. Montgomery's headquarters lay closer to the northern shoulder of the German penetration. Bradley's communications were broken. Montgomery could restore coordination faster. Bradley understood the necessity, even as it burned, he later wrote, like acid in his throat. What Bradley anticipated correctly was Montgomery's reaction. Montgomery accepted the temporary command with barely concealed satisfaction. Major General de Guingand noted in his diary that Montgomery seemed to glow. Within a day, Montgomery was reorganizing American units, redirecting supply flows, and issuing orders that contradicted existing American dispositions. Brigadier General William Keane, aide to General Hodges, recorded his commander's stunned reaction. Hodges told him Montgomery was behaving as if he had conquered the Americans, not the Germans. But Montgomery was doing more than repositioning forces. He was crafting a story. Almost immediately, he began framing the Battle of the Bulge as an American failure, one that required British intervention to correct. In communications to London, in conversations with British officers, in meetings with war correspondents, he portrayed American forces as unprepared and poorly led. Major General John Whiteley, Deputy Chief of Staff at Supreme Headquarters, watched in disbelief. Montgomery, he later said, was rewriting history in real time. The truth was far different. American forces had been surprised, yes, but they fought with ferocity that blunted the German offensive before Montgomery ever took command. At St. Vith, the 7th Armored Division held for 6 days against overwhelming odds. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne refused surrender under complete encirclement. These were not failures needing rescue. They were the actions that broke the German timetable and doomed the offensive. Montgomery either failed to understand this or chose not to. His version of events served British political interests, casting him as the indispensable commander who had saved inexperienced Americans from disaster. By late December, this narrative was spreading through British political and military circles and into London newspapers. American officers at Supreme Headquarters were furious. Captain Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide, recorded the growing rage. But Eisenhower, the coalition's anchor, chose restraint once again, responding with careful messages and quiet diplomacy. Then, on January 7, 1945, Montgomery crossed the final public line. At a press conference in Zonhoven, Belgium, he spoke for over an hour without notes. He described the Battle of the Bulge as one of the most complex battles he had ever handled. He spoke of taking personal command, of seeing the whole picture, of employing British power decisively. He praised American soldiers as brave. He called Eisenhower the team captain. He declared his loyalty, but the message was unmistakable. Montgomery had saved the Americans. News reached Versailles within hours. Butcher wrote that he had never seen Eisenhower so angry. His face flushed from red to purple. Eisenhower said aloud that Montgomery had just claimed credit for the entire operation, while American soldiers were still dying in the forests. Even then, Eisenhower hesitated to act. He warned Montgomery privately that such statements endangered Allied unity. Major General Kenneth Strong later remarked that Eisenhower's patience bordered on the miraculous. Any other commander would have relieved Montgomery on the spot, but Eisenhower understood what was at stake. Removing a British field marshal could fracture the alliance itself. So once more, he absorbed the insult. Yet every accommodation exacted a price. Brigadier General Arthur Nevins later wrote that everyone watched Eisenhower carry the burden. But while the public rupture would come days later, the private breaking point arrived first. Montgomery demanded, criticized, and claimed credit. Eisenhower endured it, but American tolerance was not limitless. And by December 29, 1944, Eisenhower knew the line had been crossed. Not publicly, but decisively. By December 1944, senior American commanders were no longer whispering their doubts. They were voicing them openly. Inside Allied headquarters, a single question kept resurfacing. Why was Eisenhower still shielding Montgomery? For Omar Bradley, the resentment had turned raw. His frustration was no longer professional, it was personal. George Patton was even less restrained, mocking Montgomery in private correspondence with undisguised contempt. Among Eisenhower's own staff at Supreme Headquarters, patience had evaporated. Montgomery's behavior was seen as corrosive, disruptive, and increasingly dangerous. Yet Eisenhower continued to hold the line. Not out of weakness, but conviction. He believed that coalition warfare demanded restraint, that unity mattered more than pride, even when that restraint came at personal cost. Then, on December 29, 1944, Montgomery's telegram arrived at Supreme Headquarters. It was not the moment the alliance fractured in public, but the moment Eisenhower decided it would no longer be allowed to fracture in private. This one was different. It was not framed as a request. It was not phrased as advice. Eisenhower read it as an ultimatum. Montgomery declared that the existing command structure was quite unworkable. He insisted that there must be a single commander for all Allied ground forces, one authority coordinating operations from Switzerland to the North Sea, and that commander, he made clear, should be him. If Eisenhower refused, Montgomery wrote, he would take the matter directly to Prime Minister Churchill and the combined chiefs of staff, where he was confident British military opinion would support his position. The threat was deliberate, calculated. Montgomery was attempting to bypass Eisenhower entirely, using political pressure to force a change in command. Colonel James G., the British liaison officer at Supreme Headquarters, grasped the significance immediately. Montgomery had finally gone too far. He believed he held every advantage. What he failed to see was that he had just declared open war on Eisenhower's authority. The telegram amounted to an attempt to bypass Eisenhower's authority under the guise of professional disagreement. Eisenhower read it 3 times. Then he stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the frozen winter landscape for nearly 5 minutes. When he returned to his desk, the change was unmistakable. This was no longer diplomacy. This was decision. He summoned his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith. What followed would determine whether Eisenhower remained supreme commander or was reduced to a ceremonial mediator between competing national interests. Smith arrived within minutes. Eisenhower was already drafting a response. This was not another carefully balanced message to Washington. The language was stark, final. In his message to Marshall, Eisenhower wrote that Montgomery's attitude had become intolerable, that his demand was completely unacceptable. He stated that he had referred his own position to General George Marshall and the combined chiefs of staff with a single condition. They must choose between him and Montgomery. One of them would leave the European theater, and Eisenhower made clear that he was prepared to be that man if necessary. The draft ended with a blunt admission. He was finished making excuses for a man who believed his nationality placed him above everyone else. Smith read the message and looked up, stunned. Eisenhower met his gaze steadily. He said simply that he had had enough. Smith understood immediately. This was not anger speaking. This was resolve. But Smith was a master staff officer for a reason. He knew that while Eisenhower's position was justified, the execution required precision. He persuaded Eisenhower to allow him to draft a parallel communication to Marshall, one that Washington could act upon without hesitation. That evening, the telegram sent to Marshall was calm, professional, and unmistakable in meaning. Eisenhower outlined Montgomery's demand, explained why it was militarily unsound and politically impossible, and concluded that the situation had reached a breaking point. Either Montgomery accepted Eisenhower's authority, or Eisenhower could no longer function effectively as Supreme Commander. He requested an immediate decision. Marshall received the message late on December 29th. He read it twice. Then he called Admiral Ernest King and General Henry Hap Arnold. Within an hour, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were assembled. Marshall spoke plainly. Eisenhower was prepared to resign unless Montgomery backed down. The question was simple: support their commander or allow the British to dictate Allied command. The discussion was brief. Admiral King was blunt. They supported Eisenhower, period. If Britain wanted Montgomery in charge, they could fight their own war. Arnold agreed. Eisenhower had carried Montgomery for months. If Montgomery could not serve under American command, he had to go. Marshall immediately drafted a reply, but he did not stop there. Understanding that the crisis demanded political resolution, Marshall contacted the White House and requested an immediate meeting with President Franklin Roosevelt. That night, he briefed the president fully. Roosevelt's response was characteristically direct. Eisenhower stays. Montgomery obeys, or he's finished. Call Churchill and make it clear. The American position was now absolute. Command authority was not negotiable. The alliance would either operate under a single authority or risk fracturing under competing national commands. In London, Washington's telegram reached Downing Street in the early hours of December 30th. Churchill read it and immediately understood the scale of the confrontation. "Good God," he remarked. "Eisenhower has actually done it. He's forced the issue." Churchill knew the stakes. Britain could not win this fight. By late 1944, American power dwarfed Britain's contribution. More divisions in Europe, unmatched logistics, industrial output sustaining the entire campaign. If this became a test of wills, Britain risked losing not just the argument, but its influence in the post-war world. Churchill acted decisively. He summoned Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff. Brooke defended Montgomery's tactical reasoning, but Churchill cut him off. Tactical correctness was irrelevant. Montgomery had threatened his superior. To Churchill, it amounted to insubordination. Defending it would cost Britain Eisenhower and possibly American cooperation altogether. Churchill drafted his own message to Montgomery that morning. Polite in tone, absolute in meaning. Montgomery must back down, immediately. Montgomery received both Churchill's directive and Eisenhower's escalation on the morning of December 30th. His chief of staff, de Guingand, already understood the reality. He told Montgomery bluntly that he had miscalculated. He thought the Americans needed him more than he needed them. He was wrong. What followed was one of the quickest reversals Eisenhower's staff had ever witnessed. Montgomery's reply reached Supreme Headquarters the same day. The tone was conciliatory, almost apologetic. He wrote that he was distressed Eisenhower should be concerned and urged him to put the matter aside. He declared himself absolutely devoted to Eisenhower's service, his most loyal subordinate. Every implication of his earlier demand was withdrawn. Whatever Eisenhower decided, Montgomery would support without reservation. If the current command structure remained unchanged, he would accept it fully. He closed by reaffirming, almost pleading, that he remained under Eisenhower's command. But the moment had passed. On January 1st, 1945, Eisenhower issued new directives. 1st and 9th Armies would return to Bradley as soon as conditions allowed. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would retain its sector, with fixed boundaries and objectives. Most importantly, Eisenhower stated explicitly that he exercised complete command authority over all Allied forces. His decisions were final. The effect was immediate. The era of negotiating with Montgomery was over. Those inside headquarters noticed the change at once. Before December 29th, Montgomery issued demands, and Eisenhower worked around them. Afterward, the response was simple: comply, or Eisenhower would take the matter straight to Marshall. The relationship never recovered. Eisenhower and Montgomery continued to work together through the final campaigns, professionally, efficiently, without warmth. Meetings became formal, discussions brief, strictly business. Bradley, by contrast, was openly grateful. On January 10th, he wrote to Eisenhower thanking him for standing firm. Montgomery's conduct during the Bulge, Bradley believed, had insulted every American who fought and died in those forests. In his memoirs, Bradley later wrote that December 29th was the day Eisenhower stopped trying to satisfy everyone and started commanding as Supreme Commander. The episode revealed something essential about Eisenhower. The press conference exposed the crisis. The telegram forced the decision. He was willing to compromise, but only to a point. When that point was reached, he acted with decisive finality. Montgomery found the line. The lesson endures. Coalition leadership is not about endless accommodation. It is about creating a system where national pride coexists with unified command, where political realities are acknowledged, but authority is respected. And sometimes leadership means risking the alliance itself to preserve it. Eisenhower understood that. On December 29, 1944, he proved it, and in doing so, made the alliance stronger for the final march into Germany. Because the hardest decision a commander faces is not always defeating the enemy. Sometimes it is standing firm against an ally who has forgotten who is in command.